Applause for David Craddock.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm in a competition with the other talk, so I'm going to talk really, really fast and catch up with them. No, not really. So yeah, my name is David Craddock. I wrote a book called Dungeon Hacks, published it last year. And my goal with that was to focus some on the design of seminal, classic roguelike games, but also to tell the stories of the people who made the games and the culture and the technology and how they all those things kind of gelled to allow them to make their games. If you're interested in the book, in chronological order, the chapters go from Beneath Apple Manor to a little game you might have heard of called Rogue, to Sword of Fargoal, Hack, NetHack, Moria, Angband, and Adom. And I want to talk to you a bit about the history of roguelike games today, but from the perspective of somewhat of a roguelike newbie, which I totally was going into Dungeon Hacks. I got the idea to write the book while I was researching and writing another book called Awhile and Listen, which chronicles the making of Diablo in the early years of Blizzard North. And I thought, Diablo is definitely much more of a mainstream game, and so to provide kind of foundation for readers, I'd like to track down some roguelike developers and get some quotes from them, so to kind of build a foundation on which to build on. And the first person I spoke to was Glenn Wickman, and as I talked to Glenn, I got really caught up in his stories, just as much his stories working at Disneyland as as working on Rogue. And I thought, this is such an exciting topic. I don't want it to amount to just a few paragraphs in another book. I thought Roguelikes deserved a book of their own. And so I spun off Dungeon Hacks from there, and really it deals with just a microcosm of these games, but I wanted to share with you today some of the really cool and exciting things that I learned in researching the writing book, again, from the perspective of someone who doesn't know nearly as much about this as all of you do, probably. The first thing I noticed was that, of course, roguelikes originated primarily from college students who were writing and playing roguelikes while they were in school, and I noticed almost to a person that the idea of writing and playing roguelikes very quickly came into direct conflict with maintaining their GPAs in school. Even in speaking with David Brevik, who had the idea for Diablo, he was so passionate about his addiction, as he described it, to NetHack and Angband, and how he really wanted to create Diablo as sort of an homage to these games that he'd played in college. In fact, one developer I spoke to for Dungeon Hacks swore me to secrecy. He asked, please say that I did graduate, because that's what my LinkedIn page say, and Mom and Dad think that I did. So if you could just help me keep that going, that would be great. The second thing that I noticed was, and I found this really fascinating, the commonalities shared between guys like Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman, Ken Arnold, Don Worth, who wrote Beneath Apple Manor. And that was, first of all, they had this all-consuming passion for Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was still a relatively newish thing when roguelikes started to appear, and it was just the natural inclination of people who wrote those games to look at Dungeons & Dragons and say, well, wouldn't it be cool if there were a computerized version of this, so I could kind of offload all of the dice rolling and calculations onto the computer, which was the second commonality. Early access to computers. You couldn't really go into most stores and just take home a computer for less than the cost of a car. The people who wrote these games were very lucky to be bright and inquisitive and having access to computers to do annoying things like write papers for school, and also fun things like write new types of role-playing games. The third thing that I noticed was how technology and their access to technology informed their design, and in many cases limited it, but not in a bad way. For example, in speaking with Michael and Ken and Glenn, they told me a lot of stories about how, they were working with very limited storage and memory. And so they didn't have the technical ability to create sophisticated AI for a lot of the enemies. So a lot of their monsters amounted to, well, if you're lower down, you have more hit points and you do more damage. But as Michael would tell me, a lot of players would get so immersed in the game, their play testers in the labs, that they would start ascribing behaviors that didn't exist at all, but they would swear that they did. And Glenn even told me a really interesting story about how they programmed the bat to kind of move in a zigzag pattern to simulate its flight, and players would start to learn that, well, if I lure these bats into narrow corridors, they won't be able to move while I throw or shoot arrows at them. So it was really cool how these games just sort of captured the imagination of players and got them to start learning how to manipulate their AI, and also just completely telling the guys who made the game, no, this is how this monster works, I swear. Another limitation that turned into a boon came up with Jeff McCord when he wrote Sword of Fargoal. The object of that game, as many of you probably know, is you go down to the bottom of the dungeon, you get the Protectorate sword, and then you have to get all the way back up within a very short time frame. A timer starts ticking. And Jeff said that he wanted to recycle the levels that players had already traversed on the way back up. In other words, you go back through floors you already explored that just filled with new monsters. But he wrote that game on a Commodore PET. It didn't really have enough memory to hold on to the random number seed. So he said, well, it's a magical dungeon, so it rejiggers itself, and there are brand new levels. And that added an interesting layer of tension to the game, because now you have the sword, you have a timer ticking, the enemies are much tougher going back up than they were on the way down, and you're having to explore brand new maps. Don Worth, who wrote Beneath Apple Manor, encountered a similar limitation on the Apple II, which he wrote the game on. He limited his treasures to one treasure per dungeon floor. And he said that he would watch some of his friends. Some of them would inch through, kind of explore the levels, find treasures, die inevitably. Others started to just race through the levels. They would find the treasure room as quickly as possible and do this floor over floor, so that by the time they got to the fifth level or so, they hadn't killed a thing, but they had a lot of the best treasures, and then they would kind of walk with more swagger and start killing the monsters as they went down. So again, just kind of emergent behavior happening, players kind of taking the wheel and deciding how they're going to play these games. The fourth cool thing that I noticed was that roguelikes served as a powerful learning tool. I don't know many game programmers who said, I'm going to learn how to program so that I can write the next version of Word. No, you want to write really cool games, and that was the case with a lot of these roguelikes. Glenn Wickman had been writing and designing his own games, card and board games, for years. And when he met Michael, he said that he was actually programming an adventure game creator, which let users build their own text adventure games in the vein of Colossal Cave without writing a line of code. But he wasn't really that familiar with C yet. So when he and Michael started the game, what they did was Michael wrote a lot of the code, and he and Glenn both bounced ideas back and forth. And Glenn learned a lot about C just through osmosis, kind of watching over Michael's shoulder. Another example of roguelikes as learning tools that really resonated with me was the example of Jay Fenlison's hack. Jay attended a programming class at Lincoln Sudbury High School taught by Brian Harvey. Brian attended college at MIT and other campuses where computers were locked down, students were forbidden, you had to have security level clearance 5 to get in. And he was really upset by that because he viewed computers as the wave of the future and thought that students should have more access. So when he got a job teaching computer programming at Lincoln Sudbury, he handed his students the keys to the kingdom. The deal was they were allowed to come and go from the lab as they please, and even to a very large degree come up with their own curriculums, provided that they didn't break too much. And he found that the students of their own volition came up with a rotation where every day one student took point and put the couch cushions back on after it had been used as a trampoline for most of the day, straightened up the chairs, and they just took to the lab. They started to see it as theirs. And of course, one of his students, as I said, was Jay Fenlison. Jay discovered Rogue on a field trip with Brian Harvey. I believe he played it at UC Berkeley. And when he got back, he didn't have the code with him. So he wrote hack as a way of being able to play Rogue without having access to Rogue. And he kind of started building on it from there. He added some monsters, he added some behaviors, and that example really resonated with me because I had a computer science teacher in high school who was much the same way. His name was Bill Carley, and I attended high school from 96 to 2000, so we were a bit behind the curve. The programming lab at first had Apple IIs, so I started with BASIC and Pascal, and Mr. Carley was the same way as Mr. Harvey. He said, whatever you want to do, I'll help you do, and we can just build your projects together. And I thought that was a really fun way to learn. And of course, my fifth observation was that as technology advanced, the definition of roguelike began to stretch and become fluid. We saw new paradigms, new things like multi-screen dungeons. Of course, Rogue was originally kind of a 3x3 tic-tac-toe board of rooms and corridors, but pretty soon we had these multi-screen dungeons where you would only see one part of a dungeon on the screen at a time. We also saw more unique enemy behavior. And I think one of my favorite examples of that was I talked to the guys who, several members of the dev team who worked on NetHack, and they told me a lot of stories about the cockatrice, which, as you know, turns anything it touches to stone. And players found out, well, if I kill this and then put on gloves, I can pick it up and swing it around like the proverbial rubber chicken and use it as a weapon. And, if you fall down while holding the cockatrice, it will turn you to stone. And I found that really unique because, you look at these mainstream, these blockbuster games like Uncharted 4, and a lot of them are predicated on these breathtaking graphics. But at the same time, those graphics limit them. Because unless a programmer accounts and an animator get together and say, hey, if you fall down and you touch this dead monster you're holding, you can turn to stone, it can't happen. So that really interested me as the book kind of came together. The fact that on the surface, to the untrained eye, they look so rudimentary, but really the sky was the limit because you could do anything with them since it was just text outlays you were working with. Of course, roguelike development is inexorably tied up in the internet, earlier ARPANET. And one reason I started Dungeon Hacks off with a chapter about Beneath Apple Manor was because I even heard Glenn Wickman say earlier, we're kind of lucky that the genre came to be called roguelike. Because, as I said, a lot of people have these same ideas, but some of their particular circumstances influenced which games saw wider circulation. Don Worth wrote Beneath Apple Manor, or BAM, on an Apple II, and although that computer could go online, most people didn't really take it online. And so BAM didn't really spread, whereas Rogue just kind of started appearing everywhere. And I thought that was a really cool set of circumstances. It also allowed roguelike developers to begin passing the torch. Jay Fenlison, when he wrote Hack, he put a copyright at the top that basically said, in short, you are free to take this code and expand and modify it, just so long as you keep the copyright intact so that others are encouraged to do the same. And that led to the advent of NetHack and the dev team and the idea that these people collaborating on the same game from their respective corners of the world could work on it and never cross paths, and maybe still haven't, which is one of the most exciting things about being here today, is I imagine we're meeting a lot of our online friends for the very first time. I'm seeing some of the developers I spoke to for the book, and it's really cool to finally be in the same room rather than the same chat room with them. Angband kind of grew in the same way. You have the vanilla Angband code base, but while the NetHack dev team really kind of keeps the game under lock and key, Angband's code is spread into different flavors and variants. So you have a lot of Angband players out there who might have never played vanilla Angband, but they found the code and they modify it, and now they're purveyors of their own unique flavors of the game. The sixth of the seven things I wanted to talk about is how, again, the definition of roguelike is so fluid. We see a nice balance of emergent gameplay and player-driven storytelling and authorial storytelling. One of my favorite games to write about was Thomas Biscop's Atom. He told me that he discovered roguelikes through Hack and NetHack, and while he enjoyed them, what was missing for him was the idea of being able to partake in a story, whereas NetHack was kind of more of a puzzle to be solved. How do I optimize my character? How do I get down to good old Rodney's Amulet of Yendor in the best way possible? And so with ADOM, he started putting together this finely tuned balance of static elements and procedural elements, so that the adventure is new every time you play, but you also feel like you are part of a larger story and playing a big role in that. I also think it's interesting how roguelikes have given way to roguelike likes, probably the most popular of which is still Diablo, which again, David Brevik really fought tooth and nail with Blizzard Entertainment, the game's publisher, to make this a roguelike. His vision was it's a single-player, turn-based game with procedural content, but with graphics. And he lost those battles. It became real-time. It added a multiplayer component. And one of the other battles that he lost was permadeath. He said there was nothing better in college than staying up all night. His character was on the ropes. A monster was on the ropes. The next key he pressed determined whether he was going to strut out or spend the next day kind of sobbing into his pillow and having to start over. And when the time came to make Diablo 2, he fought again and finally reached the compromise. When you finish Diablo 2 for the first time with a regular character, you get the option to unlock hardcore. One death and that's it, you're done. And it turns out that he was right. When Diablo 3 was published, a few months after it was published in 2012, one of Diablo 3's lead developers did a Reddit AMA and disclosed that of the 7 million people or so who were playing the game, over 300,000 of them preferred to play exclusively in hardcore mode because the risk of cause and effect and knowing that you had to live with your consequences was so much more compelling, especially in an era where mainstream games had become increasingly hand-holdy and casual. And my favorite example of a game that on the surface doesn't appear to be a roguelike at all is Dark Souls. The levels are static, the enemy placement is static, the item placement is static, but it has kind of a twist on permadeath. When you die in Dark Souls, you leave a blood stain that holds all of your souls, which function as experience points, and you have one chance to get back to it. If you die, the blood stain is gone forever. So I thought that was a really cool kind of twist on the idea of you get a second chance, but if you blow it, you don't have to start over, but those souls and the 4 hours you spent farming them are gone for good. The 7DRL was one of my favorite components of writing dungeon hacks. Midway through, I was speaking a lot with Darren Gray, who's one of the most popular figures, I think, in the 7DRL community, and I decided to write a companion book to dungeon hacks called 1 Week Dungeon's Diary of a 7-Day Roguelike. The idea was I went on Roguelike Temple and a few other forums and posted messages saying, hey, I'm writing this book about 7DRL and roguelike development. If you have 10 to 15 minutes a day, I'd love to catch up with you and just see whether you're ahead, whether you're behind, how you're feeling about your project. And it was really cool to observe this spectrum of roguelike games being made. You had twists on classic roguelikes, such as Ed Cullis's, I believe it was called TriQuest, where it was a dungeon crawl, but on an overworld, and you had a configuration of 3 character archetypes, and the arrangement dictated who dealt damage and who took damage. And you had other games like Darren Gray's Mosaic, which was musically oriented. So it was just really cool to see the fact that we're all here because we all love roguelikes, but maybe our definition of what constitutes a roguelike, and let's not fight about it, could be different, and yet we still share that same passion for the genre. Which brings me to my 7th and final observation. As someone, again, who came in not knowing how these games were played and finding them very esoteric, but more and more engrossing as I got into them. You can go on Steam today and filter game results by roguelike and get dozens and dozens of pages. You can love to play roguelikes. You can love to write them, or even commit yourself to writing a certain component of a roguelike. I spoke to members of the Angband dev team. Damn Angband. who said, I really want to devote myself to how often certain items pop up, and I want levels and what sort of stats they have. And I just think it's really cool that their roguelikes are really a genre for everyone. And I think it's cool that we're here celebrating over 30 years at these games, and I know we'll be celebrating many more over the years to come. So thank you for letting me ramble for a little bit. I'm sorry? Volume 2, yes, I would love to do a Volume 2, because like I said, I only got to write about a fraction of these games. I'm fortunate to be a writer who's very backlogged. I just released a book this past week called Making Fun, Stories of Game Development. I have another hardcover, or my first hardcover coming out next year, called Breakout, How the Apple II Launched the PC Gaming Revolution, which I kind of did the same thing I did with Dungeon Hacks. I tracked down / stalked to the point of annoyance a lot of developers such as Jordan Mechner and the founders of Broderbund to talk about their games. But I would love to dive into another volume of Dungeon Hacks because there's so much more to talk about. So, any other questions?
How much overlap is there between roguelike developers and other games?
It's really, they all kind of were in their own bubble at first, which is what I found so interesting. Again, Don Worth, who made Beneath Apple Manor, had never met the Rogue Trio or vice versa, and yet their shared interests from their respective pockets of the world kind of led them along parallel paths. And so when the overlap that I noticed was that in the beginning, a lot of people found Rogue, and then as time went on, and kind of a lot of the core games started to appear, like Hack and Moria and NetHack, that became the starting point. But I feel like if you're committed enough to making one of these games, you probably went back at some point to see a lot of the foundations and where things had started from. Yes. No, I really liked ADOM a lot. I liked the idea of it. To me, again, as someone who kind of came into roguelikes kind of late in the game, it reminded me a lot of, I think it was Elder Scrolls 4, where you had these portals open to chaotic realms. And I just liked the idea that I had some say, like I was part of a bigger story, but I could also take lateral steps and go do my own thing for a while. Also, another shared interest that I didn't mention was Lord of the Rings. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. I write fantasy, so you kind of have to read a lot of Lord of the Rings if you're going to do that. And so I really liked Moria and Angband and a lot of the more Tolkien-esque focus roguelikes.
Okay. That's it.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. So now Glenn, Michael, and Ken will come up on stage. And David